In this lecture, we're coming to the end of Calvin's life, and we're going to discuss the final years and then his death. And when we get into the 1550s, the last real serious decade of Calvin's activity, a number of things are beginning to take a toll on the man. One of the things that we haven't discussed up until this point is Calvin's health. The fact of the matter is, if I were to list all of the things and all of the ailments that affected Calvin at this point, they would be altogether shocking for most of you if you are not aware of just the state of the way people lived in the 16th century, the lack of medication, the lack of health care, or the basic knowledge of the way to deal with so many of the things that you and I take for granted. For most of his life, Calvin was a relatively ill man, frequently sick, frequently having to spend days or weeks in bed, trying to fast out or work through whatever predicament was upon him at any given time. We know that he had parasites in his stool. We know that he had issues with his blood. We know that at times he found breathing difficult. Now, in some ways, this was typical for this day and age, particularly as one got on in years. But for Calvin, this was particularly a very painful part of his life. The ailments that he lists are a bit over the top, even for the standards of his own day. And on top of that, Calvin went through a series of controversies and fights in the 1550s that sapped his energy and his strength, and that drew him out of the context of Geneva to take part in the wider Reformation through either polemic or through debate. There are really two controversies, two main issues that go on here. One is the ongoing fallout from the Servetus affair. A man by the name of Sebastian Castellio was in particular Calvin's biggest opponent, attacking not only Calvin's role in shaping the death of Servetus, but also attacking his theology. And Calvin did his best to defend himself, and even in the 1559 Institutes, there are comments in places where he sees fit to take on Castellio all the way until the end of his life. And we don't need to go into this debate or this controversy so much. However, there is another one that is vitally important for understanding the shape of where Reformed and Lutheran voices and the consensus in the Reformed world is going to go after the death of Calvin and Bullinger and others. Within Lutheranism, there had arisen a split following the death of Luther himself. And the split was between two factions as they're named. There are the Philippists, meaning those who adhere to Philip Melanchthon's more moderate reading or more independent reading of the theology of Luther himself. Melanchthon, of course, had given way on a really full-throated understanding of Luther's understanding of justification. Melanchthon had given in somewhat, saying that our works were required on some level, and we discussed this previously in a lecture under Luther. Well, there was another group, the Gnasio-Lutherans, which translates roughly into the true Lutherans. And these were the folks who believed that their reading of Luther, the very intense reading of Luther, was the only one that was acceptable for those who were going to continue on with that name. Well, one of the major figures who comes on the scene within the Gnasio movement is Joachim Westphal. And Westphal was a real nobody from the city of Hamburg. He'd been a pastor, but he was a devotee of Luther, and he was an antagonist to Melanchthon. And what Westphal does over the course of the late 1540s and into the 1550s is he begins to attack, much in the same way Luther did in the 1530s, the group that he called the Sacramentarians. And of course, when Luther had done this in the 1530s, he met Zwingli in Zurich specifically. Westphal, though, takes the tactic of including just about anyone whom we would consider to be Reformed. Calvin, Oecolampadius, Butzer, Bullinger, and Zurich, all of these folks get lumped in with Westphal due to a document known as the Consensus Tigurinus. And this was a document from the 1540s in which Calvin and Bullinger in particular had come together and decided upon some language where they could affirm that they were in essential agreement with one another on the subject of the Lord's Supper. Well, Westphal takes this as a sign, in particular, that Calvin and Butzer and all these fellows who had been wooing Melanchthon and who had been friends with Melanchthon all these years were in fact sacramentarians. And of course, the word sacramentarian, the Schwärmerei, as Luther had called them, were simply anathema to those within the Lutheran faith. In other words, what Westphal is doing here is not first and foremost attacking Bullinger or Calvin or any of these reformers. Rather, he's attacking Melanchthon. He wants to convince the other Lutherans that Melanchthon's friendship with some of these men, his respect for them, and his back-and-forth treatises and letters and support were signs that Melanchthon himself was a sacramentarian. And by and large, Bullinger believed this to be the case. He had not quite stepped into the fray, he had stayed out of it for a period of time. And that was, of course, until in the 1550s, Calvin becomes aware of this debate and this fight. And you'll recall that Calvin and Butzer are really somewhere in between Zurich and Bullinger on the one hand, and where the Lutherans were on the other. Bullinger and Butzer, of course, had had a pretty frosty relationship over the decades, all the way until Butzer's death in 1551. But Calvin took it as irksome, one, that he was being called a sacramentarian, and two, that he was being attacked in print for being somehow disingenuous and completely antithetical to the Lutheran Reformation. And so it's at this point that Calvin really takes the stage in one of his most public theological squabbles with the powerhouse of the Lutheran faith within the Holy Roman Empire. Now again, it's important to get this right. Westphal was a relatively no-name figure. His attacks on Melanchthon were having only a marginal effect at first. Melanchthon was just simply too much of a powerhouse. He had been Luther's right-hand man, and Westphal really didn't have much of a leg up when it came to attacking him. Well, what Calvin quickly realizes is that he just walked into a fight with a badger. He was sort of pinned up with this Westphal, who was just really ready to go to task on him. Calvin really was unable or unwilling to keep up the pace with Westphal in terms of the output. And, frankly, due to the fact that Calvin and eventually Bullinger step into the fray with Westphal, this gives Westphal a significant amount of ammunition, and as a result, the heat is further put upon Melanchthon as to where he stood with his views. Well, it all begins in 1552. Westphal publishes another tract, this time attacking by name the Reformed voices and their view of the sacraments. He is particularly nasty, as tends to happen in polemic in this day, but even by the standards of the 16th century, Westphal is particularly vicious. And Calvin is drawn into this, and he begins to write back and forth with Bullinger. And he argues that he and Bullinger, but in particular he, would draft a response to this. And so they began to send a short treatise of about 55 pages back and forth. Calvin writes it at first, and the first draft of it, according to the Zurichers, according to Bullinger, is far too Butzerian, you might say, far too much in the middle point for their taste. One of the moves that Calvin does in this is he actually argues that Westphal is not a very good Lutheran. He argues that Luther himself, if he had been alive, would be more in line with his own teaching and with the teachings of Melanchthon than he would with Westphal. The problem, of course, is that's just simply not true. Calvin did not really know too much of Luther's theology on this point. He hadn't read everything, and Bullinger was quick to point this out. There was some tension, in fact, between Calvin and Bullinger. Bullinger really sees this more as the real outflowing of what Luther taught in the person of Westphal. Calvin's tactic was rather to say that Westphal was the crazy man, and that Bullinger, Melanchthon, Butzer, and Bullinger and Calvin were more of the centrist position, but Bullinger really wasn't on that same wavelength. But in the end, they do come to an agreement, and in 1555, there is published, technically signed as having been written by all of the reformers in the Swiss regions, but known by everybody to have been written by Calvin, the defense of the Reformed view of the sacrament. Now, Bullinger and Calvin, again, really believe that they're going to put Westphal in his place. Calvin describes Westphal as a lightweight, and Bullinger, less inclined to name-call than Calvin, nevertheless admits that with Westphal they're being persecuted more, he says, than the papists persecute us. And Bullinger refers to him as savage and illiterate. Now, the problem with all this, though, is Melanchthon really wasn't willing to get involved. He kind of wanted the matter to go away. He wanted to ignore the situation. And Calvin admits to Bullinger that Melanchthon is going to be, quote, less courageous than is fitting. Now, what's interesting about this first step into the fight with Westphal is not only that you see Calvin really taking the lead. This is one of the first times, if not the first major time, that Calvin is really cajoling and drawing Bullinger and the other Reformed people into his orbit as he is describing what he believes to be the Reformed view of the sacrament. So, for example, Calvin very boldly says, which of us, meaning which of the Swiss people, does not maintain that there is something real beneath the symbol? Now, this is telling. That phrase, by and large, would not be uttered in Zurich. This is a bit too slippery for them. They're not concerned so much with defending the real presence, because in their mind, those who defend so do so in order to defend physical presence in the Eucharist. But this is telling. Calvin is very, very strong on this. And we'll see this when we discuss Calvin on the sacraments. He never says that the Lord's Supper is a mere memorial, that it's just a liturgy or a time of reflection on the Last Supper. He says here there is a real presence in the Eucharist. Now, he's going to say that this is a spiritual presence by the Holy Spirit, but he is not committed to a more Zwinglian line. But then again, he also says that his views and those of the Zwinglians are, quote, not irreconcilable. In other words, the fight with Westphal really pushes Zurich and Geneva closer together. They realize that they are closer than they might have believed when they didn't have to square their own views over against those of the Lutherans. And it's worth saying now that within the Reformed tradition, there has always been sort of two poles, two opposites, between those who are more Zuricher and those who are more in line with Calvin. Calvin's views do not dominate fully because there is always a pull towards the Zwinglian Zurich line, which stresses more the memorial side of the Eucharist rather than the spiritual presence. But here Calvin is being magnanimous with his colleagues up in Zurich. But again, the problem is that Westphal is really tenacious. He does not back down, and now that he has been drawn into a more public, large stage debate between himself and Calvin and Bullinger, he just simply unleashes and unloads with tract after tract and treatise after treatise against these men. In fact, so much so that the next year in 1556, Calvin and the others release a second defense of the sacrament. Only this time, their energy is beginning to fade just a bit as they are unable to keep up with Westphal. And then even Bullinger, a man who was never prone to wage into the battle with anyone publicly in this way, a man who is very much opposed to polemic, at least polemic in print, even himself takes on the sacraments and pushes the Reformed view out into the wider European world so that the teachings of Westphal do not become axiomatically true with all the slanderous things he says about the so-called sacramentarians down there in the Swiss regions. And by and large, again, Calvin and Bullinger are unprepared for what Westphal is able to accomplish. In many ways, if they had just stayed out of it, Westphal might have remained a small blip on the screen in terms of his teachings with the Lutheran body. Melanchthon might very well have simply endured the onslaught and it might have gone away. Now, though, Melanchthon was put in an awkward position. Calvin and Bullinger in particular were defending him as not all that different from themselves. And Calvin in particular is taking the tactic of saying that Luther and Melanchthon and he would include in this Bullinger, are the ones that are in agreement, despite the fact that no one in the Lutheran lands will believe Calvin on this point. In the end, it doesn't actually lead to a full bridging of the divide between Zurich and Geneva. At one point, the teachings of Westphal actually signal part of the problem, which is that for Bullinger, the problem is Luther himself. The problem is actually what Luther taught on the sacraments, while for Calvin, being a good disciple of Butzer, he believes that it's rather more of a misunderstanding, and cooler heads will prevail. By 1557, in fact, the two are actually beginning to squabble just a bit as to their interpretation of the fundamental problem. And Bullinger, by this point, has said to Calvin that, quote, "You ascribe to Luther teachings that, if he were alive, he would not maintain." And by 1557, Calvin admits in a letter to another friend that Bullinger, quote, "compares me to Butzer," which by now you should see is a bit of an insult. Though for Calvin it really wasn't so much of an insult, but for Bullinger it was. In the end, the relationship between Bullinger and Calvin never fully comes to an end, but it never fully comes to the full marriage of the two cities and the two Reformed voices that will go on to shape the Reformed voice thereafter. The other factor in Calvin's life is that he loses a couple of friends, and in the end he has to choose a successor, and he does so in the man of Theodore Beza. With Calvin's earlier friendships, they actually come onto rocky ground, and in one case, with that of Farel, it ruptures almost entirely. Farel, of course, as we've seen, is not the wisest of men. He's a bit of a hothead. He charges ahead with his emotions and only reflects on it after the fact. Well, in this case, he does something that is altogether dunderheaded, which is that in 1558, Farel decides it is time for him to marry. And there had been a family living with him for some time, and part of that family was a young girl by the age of 16. And in 1558, Farel is 69 years old, and he gets the absolutely bonkers idea that he is going to marry this 16-year-old girl. Calvin is incensed. Farel travels to Geneva to ask him about it, and Calvin tells him bluntly, "You do not do this. This is unseemly. This is fodder for those who are Catholic, who have been alleging all along that Protestants are really only doing this for the sake of their own lust, that they left the church because they were priests who could not be celibate. And now you hear this ridiculously old man, and 69 in the 16th century is ridiculously old, you're going to marry a 16-year-old and ruin this for everybody." And Farel, sure enough, doesn't listen, and he marries her anyway. And they have a son together, and he carries on with his work. Calvin in a letter publicly says that he believes Farel has lost his mind. And around Europe, particularly back in Paris with the French world, the gossip and the rumor that this leader of the Reformed Swiss region, a former French humanist, had done this was cause for enormous scandal and mockery and derision of the Protestant faith. And Calvin essentially breaks ties with them all the way until the end of his life. He writes his friend off for this foolishness of putting in jeopardy the Reformation world, all for the sake of his own comfort or convenience. And they do meet one last time before Calvin dies, but the relationship is never the same. The other relationship, of course, was with Pierre Viret, the man who had been there with Farel in the room when they had asked Calvin to stay in Geneva all those years ago. Viret had in many ways believed that he might be the successor in the city of Geneva. And by and large, there was no reason to doubt this. Viret had done just as much in the city of Lausanne as Calvin had done in Geneva, though to less success overall, and Viret had put very little out into the bloodstream or had written very little in terms of his theology. Well, as the 1550s wore on, Theodore Beza, a man from the aristocracy of the French world, had himself converted and had come to the Swiss regions. And he was a younger man, and he had ended up for a time in Lausanne, where he and Viret had actually come to a number of disagreements and squabbles along the way. And it was to Viret's horror that in the end, Calvin believed that Beza, though clearly an independent thinker, he was his own man, he was going to say what he believed, though he was loyal to Calvin in the main. Beza, not Viret or anyone else, was blessed by Calvin to be the man to take the Reformation reins from him when he died. And so, like Farel, Viret and Calvin, by the end of his life, do not end on the most positive terms. They don't become enemies by any means. But Calvin has to make the hard call, and he believes that Beza, being himself aristocratic, having enormous connections back in Paris and France, and himself being a pretty subtle thinker, was the man who should get the blessing. And so he does. Calvin's life by the end was marked by a number of publications that, of course, we have to mention. It was in the last years of his life, of course, in 1559, when the final edition of the Institutes is published. And it is published to enormous fanfare and success. It goes on to be a bestseller in a number of different languages. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, it's one of the most, if not the most, published tract on theology in the English language. And this is true in other countries as well, and it puts Calvin as a leading light, as one of the leading writers of the entirety of the 16th century. Another work that should be cited, begun in 1555 and concluded by the end of the 1550s, is Calvin's commentary on the Psalms. Calvin on the Psalms is enormously well respected, even by scholars today in some respects. His sensitivity to the context of the ancient world and of the ancient Jews, not simply reading the Psalms in the light of today, but reading it in the light of the Old Testament Israelite context, as well as Calvin's mature reflections on the emotions and on the spiritual life, make his Psalms commentary one of the most cherished things that Calvin ever wrote by those who read Reformation literature. Well, in the end, Calvin died in the spring of 1564. To the end, he was racked by illness and pain and all kinds of things, and he worked as hard as he could all the way to the end of his life. Calvin's writing output throughout the majority of his life matched that of Luther, sermons and tracts and treatises, to say nothing of the institutes themselves. But the man worked so hard, and his illnesses and his frailty so great, that he died in 1564 at only the age of 55. But the legacy he left, despite the fact that he made enemies and despite the fact that over time he even lost a few friends, cannot erase the fact that his writings, for their clarity and for the force of their argument, went on to shape several centuries of theology thereafter and all the way until the modern world. Okay, that's it. Next, we pivot to the last third of this course, where we begin to compare and contrast the different theological motifs and ideas between Luther and Calvin and see if we can come to places where they converge and the not few places where they diverge.